Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the men who bore the heaviest burden of medieval justice. The executioners, whose lives were bound to law, stigma, and the silence of death. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. In the earliest centuries of the Middle Ages, punishment was a duty that rested not upon one man, but upon the community. Soldiers, sheriffs, or even neighbors carried out sentences with little ceremony, their hands serving as instruments of vengeance and law. Yet, as kingdoms grew stronger and laws more carefully recorded, rulers sought consistency. Justice could no longer be left to chance or clumsy hands. Authority needed order, and so a grim profession began to take form, one dedicated entirely to carrying out the final judgment. By the 13th century, the outlines of this role were becoming clear. Towns were rising, courts were establishing more precise codes, and punishments were increasingly public. A sword swung poorly could turn authority into farce, so rulers demanded men who could wield death with certainty. From this demand, the executioner emerged, not chosen by desire, but often forced into the station, either through inheritance, punishment, or lack of other paths. His presence reflected not cruelty alone, but the growing machinery of medieval governance. Across Europe, records show that law was becoming less personal and more institutional. Instead of a feud settled with vengeance, the king's justice prevailed, and the executioner was its edge. His existence was proof that monarchs and councils claimed the exclusive right to life and death. Though despised, he was indispensable, for without him, the judgment of courts remained only words. Each swing of his sword or knot of his rope gave flesh to law, binding people to the will of their rulers. The emergence of this figure also marked a shift in how punishment was perceived. It became less about private vengeance and more about spectacle and deterrence. Crowds were summoned to watch not only the fate of the condemned, but the strength of the state itself. The executioner was the actor upon this grim stage, his movements rehearsed by necessity. Every stroke told the people that law had teeth, and those teeth belonged not to neighbors or feuding lords, but to the crown. One must remember that medieval Europe was still bound by deep religious notions. Justice was not seen as merely earthly, but also spiritual. To end a life was to send a soul before God's judgment, and so the executioner stood at the threshold between temporal punishment and eternal consequence. He was a man of law, yet also a man touching the sacred, however unwillingly. In his actions, heaven and earth seemed to meet, though seldom in harmony. It is striking how often executioners were men with no choice. Some were criminals offered pardon in exchange for the office, others born into families that already carried the burden. A few came to it from desperation, unable to find a livelihood elsewhere. Unlike blacksmiths or bakers, they did not enter by apprenticeship, but by necessity or condemnation. Their craft was not learned by curiosity, but pressed upon them by decree or circumstance. Such origins already mark them as different, as cursed. What began as an occasional role became a permanent scar upon towns. Cities recognized the need for someone skilled in death, and once an executioner was installed, he rarely left. His children bore his name with the same stain, destined either to follow his trade or live with the shadow of his father's work. Thus, the profession entrenched itself in Europe's fabric, not chosen, not celebrated, but enduring because law demanded its servant. And so, the executioner came into being, born from the union of order and cruelty, justice and fear. His role was never noble, never clean, but always necessary in the eyes of those who ruled. The 13th century gave him shape, and by the centuries that followed, he was a fixture in nearly every city and town. Where law needed an edge, he stood ready, though always with the weight of silence upon his soul. When I recall the justice of the Middle Ages, I see how deeply it relied upon the body as canvas for law. Punishment was not hidden behind prison walls but displayed before the eyes of all. Corporal and capital sentences were the most visible tools to impose order. Fines could punish the wealthy, but the poor often faced the gallows or the lash. In such a world, words of judgment meant little unless someone carried them into flesh and finality. That task fell to the man who stood apart, the executioner. Courts grew ever more complex in these centuries, binding towns together with laws both secular and ecclesiastical. Kings and councils decreed sentences for theft, murder, heresy, and treason. Yet parchment and seals could not enforce themselves. The authority of courts needed hands to enact its judgment, and so executioners became indispensable. They transformed the cold decree of the magistrate into living consequence. Their work carried the seal of legitimacy, for without them, the court was powerless before defiance. The Middle Ages had little patience for lengthy confinement. Prisons existed, but more as holding places until sentence was passed. The true punishment was to be suffered publicly, whether in pain, humiliation, or death. Branding irons marked thieves, stocks held drunkards, and rope ended lives of condemned men. Each punishment required skill, both to achieve its effect and to prevent chaos. The executioner became not only a servant of the law, but the embodiment of its certainty, standing where decree and consequence met. There was also a theatrical element woven into these acts. Medieval society believed that punishment should be seen, for sight carried weight upon the conscience. To watch a man lose his life was to witness law in its most severe expression. It was believed such sights would bind the living to obedience, lest they meet the same fate. The executioner, though despised, ensured that this theatre unfolded with precision, neither dragging into chaos nor softening into pity. This was not only the will of kings, but also of towns and guilds. Municipal councils demanded that their authority be shown, and so executioners were hired at civic expense. They were tools of both crown and community, strange bridges between rulers and the people. Their presence reminded all that disobedience carried tangible cost. One might evade a tax collector or dispute a priest, but none could ignore the final word carried out by the one who ended lives. Religious law also left its mark on their duties. Heretics and apostates faced fire, and the church, unwilling to soil itself with blood, handed them to secular arms. The executioner became the one who delivered the sentence, while priests prayed over the condemned. In this uneasy union of church and state, he played the role neither could openly acknowledge, the enforcer of orthodoxy through death. Thus, his shadow stretched not only across civic law, but also across the faith that shaped all society. Records from France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire show the consistency of this reliance. Each region, with its own courts and customs, still arrived at the same conclusion. There must be one who carries out the harshest tasks. The executioner was part of a machinery greater than himself, a cog in the grinding wheel of medieval authority. His presence was less about cruelty than about maintaining order in a world where rebellion and crime threatened fragile stability. The need for such men reveals something profound about the age. Justice in those centuries was not hidden nor softened, but made visible through pain and death. The executioner was not an aberration, but a necessity of the system, a figure both reviled and essential. His hand ensured that justice, as medieval law understood it, could be seen, feared, and remembered. Without him, authority would lose its edge, and the fabric of order might unravel before the eyes of the crowd. I have seen many kinds of men in my journeys, yet none carried the weight of disdain like the executioner. His craft ensured the law's survival, But the very people who needed him would not sit beside him at table. He was marked by an invisible brand, his touch avoided, his presence unwelcome in church or market. To live as such a man was to walk among shadows, visible but never embraced. His path was one of necessity, yet never of honor in the eyes of his neighbors. The stigma was carved into daily life with cruel precision. In many towns, executioners were forbidden to live within the walls, their homes placed on the outskirts where the gallows loomed. Guilds barred their membership, denying them the fellowship that gave others pride in their craft. Children of these families bore the same burden, treated as if stained by blood they themselves had never spilled. It was a life of exclusion, one where survival meant enduring whispers and cold stares. What made this burden heavier was the contradiction at its core. People despised the executioner, yet they gathered eagerly when his work was done. They would not touch his hand, yet they pressed forward to witness the blow he delivered. Society needed his skill, but denied him belonging, as though shunning him might cleanse them of complicity. In truth, the stigma was less about him, and more about the unease of seeing justice made flesh in so brutal a form. Marriage offered little escape, for most would not join their lives with such a family. Executioners often wed among the marginalized, tanners, knackers, gravediggers. These unions formed communities of the unwanted, bound by shared rejection. Wives and children carried the same mark, and their lives were colored by the deeds of the husband or father. To bear that name was to live on the fringes, cut off from the common joys of fellowship, guilds, and the safety of belonging. Yet, paradoxically, their presence could not be erased. The cities themselves provided their homes, their wages, their tools. They were not free men in the fullest sense, but bound servants of the law. They could not be dismissed, for no one else would take the role. This dependency deepened the paradox. The people scorned them, yet without them, the justice of town and crown faltered. Their lives were mirrors in which society glimpsed its own cruelty. Festivals and fairs rarely welcomed them, but when plague swept through or a criminal awaited judgment, the executioner was summoned without hesitation. The very hands considered unclean became indispensable when no other hands would suffice. He was called to do what others dared not, then sent back into the shadows when the task was complete. In this rhythm of rejection and reliance, the stigma endured across centuries. Historical accounts speak clearly of this burden. In Nuremberg, Strasbourg, and countless smaller towns, executioners were denied citizenship rights, their names marked in records as though bearing a permanent stain. The laws that employed them also ensured their exclusion, a contradiction written into the very structure of medieval justice. These were men who lived at the threshold, essential yet unwelcome, present yet despised. Their existence reveals the deep ambivalence of a society that demanded both purity and punishment. Thus, the executioner's life was a constant balancing of need and shame. He was feared yet mocked, sought yet avoided, a man whose craft upheld the law while condemning him to solitude. In his silence, he bore the guilt that others would not claim, though the judgments he carried out were never his own. His fate was to be both servant and exile, a man forever bound to the edge of community where law and rejection met. In certain corners of Europe, the role of the executioner did not vanish with the man's death, but passed like an unwanted heirloom to his sons. Towns found it easier to bind a family to this service than to seek new recruits, for few would volunteer. Thus, entire lineages came to bear the mark of the trade, their names tied inseparably to the scaffold. It was not uncommon for sons to learn their father's craft in silence, inheriting both his tools and his burden without choice. France offers the most famous example in the Sanson family, whose members executed for generations, reaching into the turbulent centuries beyond the Middle Ages. In Germany, the Reichards held the same grim continuity, ensuring that no city lacked skilled hands when death was ordered. These names became synonymous with their office, respected in efficiency, but still shunned in fellowship. Such dynasties illustrate how the stigma of the role hardened into a cage, trapping bloodlines within its confines. To belong to such a family was to inherit a paradox: steady income paired with ceaseless rejection. While others could seek new trades, these households were often confined to one path, repeating the father's task like an unbroken chain. This heredity served the needs of rulers who valued continuity and skill, but it stripped choice from the individuals born into it. Generations grew beneath the shadow of gallows, their fate sealed long before their first steps into adulthood. The training of sons within these families was often hidden from the public eye. Behind closed doors, they learned the handling of swords and the rituals of punishment. In some towns, boys were brought to watch their fathers at work, not as witnesses of spectacle, but as apprentices in necessity. Such learning carved deep impressions, shaping their lives long before they could question whether they wished to follow. Silence and obedience became as much a part of their heritage as the trade itself. Marriage within these families rarely extended beyond their circle, for stigma barred them from unions with respected guilds or households. Executioners often wed among their own, creating webs of kinship that locked the profession further into hereditary lines. In time, entire clans became known only for this role, their names whispered with dread or disdain. The cycle reinforced itself. The people's rejection made escape nearly impossible, ensuring that sons remained bound to the scaffold by both blood and necessity. Yet history shows that some among these families sought dignity within their burden. Records of Franz Schmidt, though later than the Middle Ages, reveal a man meticulous in his duties, recording each execution with solemn care. He longed to redeem his name, to rise above the stain placed upon his family. Such accounts remind us that within these lineages were human souls, striving to balance honor with the weight of inherited disgrace. They were not merely tools, but men shaped by a cruel inheritance. Hereditary executioners became part of Europe's memory, their permanence reflecting society's uneasy reliance upon death as justice. The continuity ensured that courts never lacked their enforcer, but it also cemented the divide between these families and the world around them. Their very constancy deepened their isolation, for the longer a name bore the role, the more it was despised. What seemed efficient for rulers became a lifelong sentence for entire bloodlines. In the end, these families remind us that stigma can be stronger than chains. Once bound to the role, escape was rare, and the burden stretched across generations. Sons carried their father's swords, daughters bore the same mark of rejection, and the lineage became indistinguishable from the office itself. The hereditary nature of the trade ensured its endurance, but at a cost measured not in coin, but in centuries of solitude and scorn. There were few paths to learn this work, for no guild offered instruction, and no school welcomed such knowledge. Training often began within the family, where sons watched fathers wield the sword or set the rope. Skills passed quietly from hand to hand, preserved not in manuals, but in lived practice. Some were introduced to the craft not by blood, but by serving under another executioner when the city required a successor. It was a form of apprenticeship that no man sought willingly, yet many endured for survival. One of the first lessons was precision. To sever a head with a single stroke required both strength and control, for hesitation meant disgrace and danger. Swords had to be raised with purpose, axes handled with balance, ropes tied with exactness. Failure could lead to a furious crowd, turning their anger upon the very man meant to embody justice. Thus, training was not only technical, but also mental, demanding calm in the face of public scrutiny. Anatomy, though not studied in universities by these men, was known to them in practice. They learned where to strike to ensure swiftness, how bones might break, and how flesh responded to iron. This knowledge was not theoretical, but born of grim repetition. Some even provided cadavers to physicians or students, making their grim experience useful beyond the scaffold. It was a form of learning unspoken, yet valuable, though it added to the aura of fear surrounding them. Beyond execution, they were expected to administer torture when courts required confession. Training thus included the handling of racks, irons, and other devices. This demanded not only skill in restraint, but knowledge of how much suffering a body could endure without immediate death. It was a dark expertise, carried out under law's command, though forever tied to the executioner's name. The burden of such training weighed heavier than the tools themselves. Practice sometimes took place away from the crowd, in hidden fields or courtyards. Young executioners might strike dummies of straw or animals to perfect their strength. Fathers corrected their sons with stern silence, knowing that failure in the marketplace would bring shame upon the family. Each exercise carried the weight of inevitability, for mistakes could not be tolerated once the crowd gathered. In this way, skill became survival as much as duty. The presence of public expectation shaped their discipline more than any written code. Executioners were judged not by guildmasters, but by the eyes of the town. To perform with steadiness preserved order, to falter risked riots. Thus, their training was as much about endurance of gaze as it was about handling steel. They were men rehearsed in bearing contempt, mastering their craft while the world recoiled from their touch. There were also rituals bound to their preparation. Some prayed before a sentence, others sharpened blades in solemn silence, knowing each tool would soon touch human flesh. Sons observed these acts, learning that execution was not only a task of the body, but a weight upon the spirit. The rhythm of preparation became part of their inheritance, an unspoken liturgy of death repeated through generations. When I think on their training, I do not see eager pupils but resigned apprentices. They were taught not to love their craft, but to bear it with as much dignity as solitude allowed. Knowledge was passed in silence, skill shaped by necessity, and endurance carved into their souls. What emerged from such training was not merely a craftsman, but a man hardened by duty, forever set apart by the lessons only death could teach. Though their lives were marred by rejection, executioners were not left unrewarded. Cities and courts understood the unpleasant nature of their duty and compensated them in ways uncommon to ordinary laborers. Some received steady wages in coin, far surpassing the earnings of peasants who toiled in fields from dawn to dusk. Others were paid per task, with executions or tortures bringing additional fees. In rare instances, they were granted rights to property or goods seized from the condemned, turning punishment into a source of livelihood. In certain German towns, records show executioners receiving portions of confiscated clothing, livestock, or even the shoes of those they put to death. These strange payments became a grim extension of their work, as if society wished to keep them tied to the very bodies they dispatched. Elsewhere, they were allotted housing by municipal councils, often near gallows fields or on the edge of town. Such dwellings symbolized both privilege and exile, for while they were provided, they also kept families apart from neighbors. Their income sometimes reached levels that allowed modest comfort. An executioner could earn enough to dine on bread and meat, own a few animals, and provide better clothing for his household. Compared to peasants or day laborers, they often lived with greater material security. Yet this wealth was hollow, for stigma still barred them from guilds, brotherhoods, and social circles. Coin could buy food and land, but it could not erase the disdain carried in whispers and turned backs. Certain privileges were attached to their station beyond money. Some were granted freedom from taxes, exemptions from tolls, or rights to attend fairs without fee. Others received annual gifts of wine, grain, or fuel from the town council, as recognition for duties performed. These perks were attempts to balance necessity with the contempt society held, ensuring that despite their isolation, executioners remained bound to their role. It was a blend of reward and containment, offering comfort while tightening the chains of stigma. One peculiar custom was the right to claim parts of executed bodies. Though morbid to us now, in the medieval world, such remains were used for healing potions or charms. Fat, bones, or hair were believed to carry curative powers, and executioners, by tradition, had access to them. This granted them a strange secondary role as suppliers of remedies, creating yet another contradiction. The same man who brought death could, in another context, provide healing. Payment thus extended beyond coin into realms of superstition and need. In France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, executioners sometimes leased land attached to their office, using it for farming or renting it to others. These holdings gave them stability rare among common folk, anchoring their families despite social exclusion. It was not uncommon to find executioner households with gardens, livestock, and modest wealth, supported by both their grim work and their granted privileges. Materially, they were secure, yet socially they remained untouchable. Still, such benefits did not erase the dangers of their position. A botched execution could cost them their wage or bring fines from the very council that employed them. At times, angry crowds threatened their lives if justice was seen as mishandled. Payment came with risk, and every privilege was balanced by the constant fear of disgrace or violence. Wealth and comfort stood always on unstable ground, dependent upon their skill in fulfilling their terrible. Thus, while executioners may have lived with more means than many peasants, they remained prisoners of their office. Their income bound them to the scaffold, their privileges tied to the gallows. Money and goods offered them survival, sometimes even modest prosperity, but never freedom from the social chains that defined them. In the end, their rewards revealed the paradox of their existence: provided for yet despised, wealthy in coin, yet poor in belonging. Among the many duties forced upon these men, few were as grim as the task of extracting confessions. Courts in medieval Europe placed great weight upon confession, often seeing it as the truest proof of guilt. Yet when words were not freely given, they turned to torment. It was the executioner who carried out these orders, guiding the instruments of pain with the same precision he used at the scaffold. His work extended from death into the very process of judgment itself, binding him deeper into the machinery of law. Torture was not arbitrary, but codified, permitted only under specific conditions by law or decree. Councils and magistrates authorized its use, believing pain could reveal hidden truth. The executioner became the hand of this belief, skilled in devices like the rack, the strappado, or the thumbscrew. Each instrument was applied with careful measure, for the intent was not to kill, but to force words from reluctant lips. He knew how far a body could be stretched before bones snapped, how long cries could be endured before silence fell. These acts were carried out in chambers often beneath city halls or within castles, far from the public squares where executions unfolded. There, in candlelit rooms, the condemned met the executioner in his most feared role. He was not only the finisher of sentences but also the midwife of them, drawing forth testimony that courts demanded. This function deepened his infamy, for even those who never faced the scaffold feared the dark cell where his presence meant agony to come. Records reveal how closely his work was tied to the courts. In Nuremberg, Franz Schmidt noted the precise use of torture during interrogations, listing the cries, the confessions, and the outcomes with the same meticulous care as executions. His journals remind us that this was not the whim of one man, but the sanctioned order of the law. The executioner's hand was steady, not because he delighted in pain, but because society placed upon him the burden of cruelty in the name of justice. Though detested for it, his role as torturer was a reflection of the beliefs of his age. Medieval people saw truth and justice as matters of divine order, and pain was thought to expose lies by stripping away human resistance. Whether by tightening ropes or applying irons, the executioner was seen as an instrument of this grim pursuit of truth. He bore the hatred of it, but the desire for such confessions belonged to the courts, the councils, and often the crowd outside. The knowledge required for this duty was practical and chilling. He had to recognize when pain would break resolve, and when it would destroy life. Too gentle, and the court would scorn him. Too harsh, and he might kill before confession was secured. It was a balance walked in silence, one that demanded not cruelty but precision. Still, the stigma grew heavier, for none cared to separate the man's skill from the suffering it caused. To most, he was tormentor and nothing more. The intertwining of execution and torture gave him a unique and unsettling authority. His presence marked the beginning and the end of justice's path, from confession torn from the body to the final strike of the blade. He embodied both process and conclusion, a man woven into every stage of punishment. This dual role made him indispensable, but it also deepened the rejection he faced. For how could a man who wielded such power ever walk among his neighbors without suspicion? Thus, the executioner's life was never bound only to death. It was also tethered to suffering inflicted in life, shaping him into a figure both feared and hated long before the scaffold rose. His hands brought truth as courts defined it, yet those same hands left him shunned. To be both executioner and torturer was to carry society's darkest commands upon one's shoulders, with no shield against the weight of their loathing. The manner in which a man or woman met death in the Middle Ages was rarely arbitrary. Punishment was chosen not only to end a life but to proclaim something to all who watched. Nobles, for instance, were granted the sword or axe, for beheading was seen as a swifter and more honorable death. Commoners, by contrast, most often faced the noose, their bodies swinging in the open air as both warning and display. Such distinctions reflected the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, where even in death, rank determined the manner of passing. Burning was reserved for those deemed heretics, witches, or traitors to faith. The Church, unwilling to soil itself with direct bloodshed, handed the condemned to secular authorities who carried out the fire's work. Flames consumed more than flesh. They declared spiritual defiance punished by earthly authority. Crowds gathered to watch the smoke rise, believing it a cleansing of sin as much as a spectacle of justice. In such moments, the executioner became the instrument through which faith and law intertwined. Another method, feared above most, was the breaking wheel. Murderers, highwaymen, and those who committed especially violent crimes were stretched upon this device, their limbs shattered by heavy blows. The sight was terrible, and its memory haunted towns long after the wheel was taken down. Yet, it was meant to endure in people's minds, to warn against bloodshed with the image of a body broken publicly. The executioner, skilled in wielding iron and wood, became the enforcer of this harsh deterrent. In certain regions of Germany and the Low Countries, drowning was used as punishment, especially for women convicted of crimes like infanticide. The condemned were bound and placed in sacks or thrown into rivers. This method, though less dramatic than fire or wheel, carried a symbolism of cleansing, water swallowing the guilty as judgment. Executioners in these regions had to adapt to local customs, ensuring that the sentence aligned with law and tradition. Each land bore its own ritual of punishment. Hanging, though common, took different forms across Europe. In England, it often meant slow strangulation, while in other places, executioners shortened the drop for a swifter end. Sometimes the condemned were left hanging long after death, their corpses a stark reminder at the city gates. Gallows became landmarks themselves, rising above roadsides to greet all who entered a town. The executioner's work thus lingered in wood and rope, visible to every passerby long after the act was complete. Public beheadings were also shaped by custom. Some executioners wielded broad swords, while others favoured heavy axes. A clean strike was both a mark of skill and a demand of dignity, particularly when nobles or knights were the condemned. Failure brought shame, not only to the executioner, but to the court that entrusted him. Thus, great care was taken in sharpening blades, measuring blows, and preserving ceremony. Even in death, society sought order and hierarchy through method. The variety of punishments reflected not merely cruelty, but a system of meaning. Each method carried a message: honor, shame, purification, or terror. The executioner stood as interpreter of these symbols, his actions conveying more than the end of life. He turned verdicts into visible lessons, ensuring that justice was not just spoken, but inscribed upon memory. In this way, his craft became a language of death, one that all could understand, regardless of station. Across centuries, these practices reveal the depth of medieval belief in punishment as both justice and performance. Death was not hidden away, but shaped into ritual for the crowd. The executioner's role was to ensure that every method, whether fire, rope, or blade, fulfilled its purpose with precision. He was the keeper of many tools, each tied to a different vision of law. Through his hands, the grim vocabulary of medieval justice was spoken in fire, steel, and silence. Justice in the Middle Ages was never meant to unfold in silence. Executions were performed beneath open skies, where townsfolk and travellers alike could gather to witness the fate of the condemned. Market squares, bridges, and hillsides became theatres of law, where death was not only a punishment, but a performance. The crowd's presence gave weight to the sentence, turning it into a communal act of remembrance. It was believed that the terror seen in another's end would bind the living closer to obedience. Children, elders, merchants, and peasants all pressed together to see the final act of justice. For some, it was a grim duty, a reminder of the order that sustained their fragile society. For others, it became a form of spectacle, something spoken of for weeks afterward. Markets often aligned with executions, the clamour of trade blending with the cries of the condemned. The executioner, though reviled, stood as the central figure of this stage, carrying out the moment with practiced solemnity. The procession of the condemned was itself part of the ritual. Prisoners were led through town streets, chains rattling as priests prayed beside them. Citizens leaned from windows to watch, crossing themselves or whispering curses. This march was meant to humble not only the guilty, but all who saw it, reminding each soul of the narrow line between life and disgrace. The journey to the scaffold was as much a sermon as the act of death itself. Once at the site, formalities gave shape to the event. Sentences were read aloud, crimes proclaimed, and prayers offered. Officials stood near, ensuring law's presence was felt, while priests urged repentance from the condemned. The executioner's moment came only after these rituals, his task the climax of a carefully staged drama. He was both servant and actor, required to perform with precision under the weight of countless eyes. His skill determined not only the death, but the memory left behind. The crowd's reaction could not be ignored, for their judgment carried its own danger. A clean stroke brought solemn silence, but hesitation or failure could ignite jeers, unrest, or even stones hurled in rage. The executioner lived under this pressure, aware that his reputation was bound to every blow. In this way, he was judged as much as the condemned, his craft displayed not in workshops, but in the raw scrutiny of the multitude. In times of political strife, rulers used executions as instruments of power. Rebels and traitors were dispatched with great ceremony, their deaths staged to remind the people of the crown's strength. Bodies might be displayed afterward, heads set upon spikes, or corpses left to rot as signs of authority. The executioner's work was thus woven into the political fabric of the age, his actions serving not only law, but the message of those who governed. For the people, these gatherings held a paradoxical attraction. They feared the scaffold, yet they came in throngs, compelled to see justice unfold. The sight stirred horror and fascination alike, emotions that bound communities together in the shared witnessing of law's hand. Even those who despised the executioner relied upon him to give shape to this public ritual, to ensure the drama ended as intended. So it was that medieval justice revealed itself not behind closed doors, but in the open squares of towns and cities. The executioner's role was inseparable from the stage upon which he worked, where justice was as much about spectacle as about law. His presence turned judgment into performance, ensuring that each death spoke beyond the individual, echoing into the conscience of all who stood beneath the gallows' shadow. The craft of the executioner was defined not only by his hand, but by the instruments he carried. Each tool bore a specific purpose, shaped over time by the demands of law and the expectations of the crowd. The heavy axe, with its broad blade, was favoured in parts of Europe for beheadings, while elsewhere the long executioner's sword reigned supreme. These weapons were not ordinary. They were forged with balance and precision, designed to deliver swift endings when wielded with skill. To see such a blade was to feel the weight of final judgment. Ropes were among the most common instruments, their fibres twisted strong enough to bear human weight. They were knotted carefully, for a poorly tied noose could bring disgrace to the executioner and suffering beyond intention to the condemned. Gallows stood as permanent reminders of justice, and the rope itself became a symbol of law's reach. In towns across England and Germany, the sight of one hanging against the sky was a silent warning that order stood above all. Other tools were fashioned not for swiftness, but for endurance of suffering. Branding irons marked thieves upon cheek or hand, leaving scars that proclaimed guilt long after the sentence was served. Whips tore through flesh in public squares, their sound echoing as much as their sting. These implements, too, fell into the hands of the executioner, who was required to apply them without hesitation. They were tools of memory as much as punishment, embedding law into body and community alike. The wheel, dreadful in its use, was another of his instruments. Heavy clubs and iron bars accompanied it, used to shatter limbs before bodies were bound to its spokes. Such acts demanded tools both brutal and durable, fashioned for repeated blows. Though horrific to modern eyes, these devices were regarded as lawful necessities in their time. The executioner's arsenal was thus a reflection of society's harsh vision of justice, more varied than most imagine today. Even fire, though natural, required tools to shape its sentence. Stakes, chains, and bundles of wood were prepared with care to ensure that the condemned could not escape. Executioners often oversaw these arrangements, guiding assistants as the pyres were built. Fire's role was both practical and symbolic, and the tools surrounding it, ropes, shackles, fuel, were part of the executioner's responsibilities. His craft extended beyond the swing of a blade into the very preparation of death's stage. Some instruments were personalized, becoming part of the executioner's identity. Swords, in particular, were often engraved, blessed, or handed down through generations. These blades were treated with reverence, for they carried not only steel but the burden of reputation. A sword that struck cleanly could make a name less despised, while one that faltered deepened scorn. The executioner's relationship with his tools was therefore intimate, almost sacred in its necessity. They were his companions in solitude, his means of survival and disgrace. Not all instruments were born of cruelty. Some were adapted from ordinary life. Axes used in forests, ropes used in trade, or irons used in smithies were reshaped for their darker purposes. In this way, the executioner's tools reflected the world around him, twisted from the familiar into the feared. They became extensions of ordinary craft transformed by the demands of justice. The difference lay not in their form, but in the hands that wielded them. Thus, the tools of death formed a language of their own, each carrying a message understood by all. To see the sword was to think of nobility, the rope of common fate, the fire of heresy's end. The executioner, through his arsenal, became interpreter of these grim symbols. His tools spoke when he himself remained silent, proclaiming law with steel, flame, and fibre. In their weight, shape, and sound, the instruments of death carried the voice of medieval justice. Amid the darkness of their work, a strange irony emerged. Executioners often became sought after as healers. Their knowledge of the human body, though born from death, gave them insights few others possessed. They understood how bones broke and how flesh could be cut without ending life. This practical wisdom, grim as its source was, allowed them to set fractures, staunch bleeding, and tend to wounds. Villagers who shunned them in daylight sometimes crept in secrecy to their doors, seeking help when illness or injury struck their homes. One reason for this paradox was their access to human remains. In a time when the body was seen as a source of both danger and healing, executioners were granted materials that others could not touch. Fat, bone, and blood were believed to hold medicinal properties. Recipes from medieval texts speak of salves made from human fat, used to ease joint pain, or powders ground from bone, thought to cure epilepsy. These remedies were part of a world where superstition and medicine mingled freely. Executioners also carried out bloodletting, a practice common across Europe, believed to balance the body's humours. Their skill with blades made them adept at the procedure, and many families, despite their scorn, relied on them when illness demanded such treatment. It was not unusual for an executioner to serve as both the one who brought death on the scaffold and the one who preserved life in secret chambers. This duality deepened the contradiction of their existence, feared and needed in equal measure. Some towns even formalized this role. Executioners were occasionally called leech or surgeon in records, recognized for their medical contributions alongside their grim duties. They became unofficial doctors for the poor, who lacked access to university-trained physicians. The wealthy may have avoided their care, but for common folk, the executioner's remedies often meant the difference between recovery and death. His hands, once dreaded, could in other moments be the very instruments of mercy. Accounts from the 16th century describe executioners in Germany and France offering treatments openly, their homes known as places of both punishment and healing. This practice had roots in earlier centuries, when communities realized that knowledge, even when tainted by stigma, could not be wasted. In such households, wives and children sometimes aided in preparing salves or tending to the sick, creating a hidden layer of community service beneath the shadow of their public disgrace. The Church's stance on this dual role was ambivalent. While it condemned the use of human remains for superstition, it could not deny the practical help that executioners provided. At times, their remedies were tolerated in silence, especially during plagues or wars when trained healers were scarce. Yet the moral unease remained, for how could hands stained by death also bring relief? It was a question that lingered in the minds of those who sought their aid in desperation. In their role as healers, executioners embodied the contradictions of medieval life. They were men defined by law's harshest commands, yet capable of easing suffering. Their homes stood as both places of fear and hope, thresholds where punishment and compassion coexisted. This hidden side of their work reveals a humanity often forgotten, for even those burdened by society's scorn found ways to serve beyond the gallows. So it was that the same man who wielded the sword or tightened the rope might also bind a broken arm or cure a fever. His life was not wholly confined to death, though death marked his name. In quiet moments, he offered healing, though the world seldom remembered this mercy. Within that paradox lay the essence of his existence, necessary, despised, and yet, at times, unexpectedly vital to the very community that cast him aside. The knowledge an executioner carried was unlike that of any scholar. Where physicians debated humours and clergy spoke of souls, he learned directly from the human body itself. Each stroke of a blade, each tightening of a rope, revealed truths hidden from books. He came to know the weight of a head, the strength of tendons, the resilience of bone. Though shunned, his understanding was undeniable, a form of anatomy written not in parchment, but in lived experience. Such familiarity was not pursued for curiosity, but for necessity. A clean beheading demanded exact precision, the angle of the neck, the force of the arm, the sharpness of the steel. Fail, and not only did the condemned suffer, but the crowd turned restless, sometimes violent. Executioners became practical students of anatomy, studying how muscles stretched, where arteries lay, and how quickly breath ceased when veins were severed. This knowledge, dark though it was, ensured both order and survival. Universities, when they emerged in places like Bologna and Paris, often prohibited direct dissection of the human body. Yet scholars still craved understanding, and they turned discreetly to men who dealt daily with the dead. Executioners supplied cadavers for study, their access to bodies making them silent partners in the growth of medieval medicine. Without their contribution, many of the first anatomical discoveries in Europe would have been delayed, for few others had such familiarity with the human form. This role gave them an odd place in history, despised in life, yet contributors to knowledge that advanced healing. Physicians sometimes sought them out in secret, asking for bodies to examine or observations from the scaffold. The executioner thus became a hidden bridge between the world of punishment and the pursuit of science. His grim familiarity with flesh aided those who would later heal rather than harm. Though never praised, his hands shaped the beginnings of anatomy as we know it. The breaking wheel, burnings and hangings also taught him of endurance and the limits of suffering. He saw how long breath clung to life, how much pain the body could bear, and how quickly strength collapsed under strain. These lessons, horrific in their setting, nonetheless gave him insights no physician of the age could claim. In his silence, he held knowledge of the body's frailty that others would not acquire for centuries. Yet this knowledge was carried with no glory. Unlike surgeons, who earned respect in time, the executioner bore only contempt. His understanding was dismissed by society, even as it was secretly borrowed. The stigma ensured that what he knew would never be recognized as wisdom in his own day. He remained the shadowed custodian of truths that others could not see, trapped by the paradox of being both teacher and outcast. There is a bitter irony in this. The very man tasked with ending life became one of the few who understood it most intimately. His grim education gave him mastery over the threshold between living and dying, yet his name was cursed for what he knew. In taverns and churches, his presence was unwelcome, but in dim halls of study, his contribution lingered quietly, shaping the knowledge of generations to come. Thus, the anatomy of death became his unwanted scholarship. He did not record it in books, nor speak of it openly, but it was carved into his hands and memory with every sentence he fulfilled. Through his unwilling apprenticeship, Europe gained fragments of understanding that would one day belong to medicine. His legacy in this regard is hidden, but it remains a reminder that even in society's darkest corners, knowledge can emerge from shadow. The bond between the executioner and the church was as complex as it was uneasy. Medieval faith demanded justice for heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft, yet the clergy themselves refrained from bloodshed. Canon law forbade priests from spilling life directly, and so the condemned were handed to secular powers. The executioner became the unwilling arm of this arrangement, carrying out the fire, the rope, or the sword where the church would not. He was thus entangled in holy judgment, while branded unholy by those who commanded it. When heretics were led to the stake, it was priests who preached the final sermons, but it was the executioner who bound the wood and lit the flame. The crowd saw in these acts a union of law and faith, yet the man who performed them stood apart, unblessed and despised. Though he enacted sentences that served the defense of doctrine, he received no honor in the church's eyes. Instead, his hands were seen as polluted, needing absolution if salvation were to remain possible. The paradox deepened during the Inquisition. Torture, sanctioned by papal decree, was carried out by men like him in cold chambers under ecclesiastical authority. The church avoided direct touch with instruments of pain, but still it ordered their use. The executioner's role was hidden yet central, shaping confessions that determined life or death. He bore the brunt of sin for the sake of orthodoxy, the silent laborer behind the proclamations of faith. Despite this, he sought spiritual refuge. Many executioners attended Mass at the edge of the congregation, aware of eyes that marked them as unclean. Some were denied burial in consecrated ground when their time came, reflecting the suspicion that clung to their profession. To live at odds with the faith of one's community was a torment heavier than the sword. He was caught between law's necessity and faith's rejection, condemned in spirit though obedient in duty. Yet the Church also recognized its debt, even if reluctantly. In certain towns, executioners were granted indulgences, prayers, or confessions after particularly heavy duties. Priests might absolve them in private, acknowledging that their work, though sinful, was commanded by higher law. Still, these mercies were whispered, never celebrated, as though to honor them would dishonor the sanctity of the altar. The executioner remained necessary but never embraced, tolerated but never sanctified. Legends of saints and martyrs further heightened his burden. As the faithful honored those burned, broken, or beheaded for belief, the man who carried out the sentence became a living reminder of cruelty. He was the shadow in the stories of holiness, the dark counterpart to the light of endurance. Though he wielded tools of justice, in the memory of the Church he was cast as instrument of trial, not of righteousness. His presence embodied the cruelty that saints were said to overcome. Still, he could not escape the faith that surrounded him. Bells tolled above his work, prayers were spoken beside his duties, and crosses were lifted in the moments before he struck. The sacred and the profane met in his person. Though neither claimed him fully, he was a figure at the edge of salvation, forever serving both law and faith, yet belonging fully to neither. In this tension, his existence became a symbol of the contradictions of the age. Thus, the executioner's bond with the Church was one of shadowed dependence. The clergy required his hand, but recoiled from his touch, absolved his actions, yet marked him as impure. He bore the paradox silently, his life framed by both cross and gallows. Through him, we glimpse how medieval faith wove together mercy and cruelty, demanding purity while relying on hands condemned to impurity. It was a burden that no sermon could ever lighten. The burden of the executioner's name did not fall upon the man alone. His wife, bound to him by marriage, carried the same weight of exclusion. Townsfolk who avoided his touch avoided hers as well, and the stain of his profession marked every corner of domestic life. Children born into such households grew up under suspicion, inheriting the rejection of their father. In this way, the family itself became an extension of the scaffold, living embodiments of a stigma they did not choose. Marriage for these families was rarely free. Few outside their circle would accept such unions, forcing them to wed among their own kind, or with others also cast to the margins. Daughters of executioners often became wives of gravediggers, knackers, or men of equally despised trades. Sons, in turn, married within executioner clans, tightening bonds of shared disgrace. Such unions formed a shadow society, invisible yet enduring, carried forward by necessity more than desire. Wives sometimes aided in the tasks that surrounded the work. They might help prepare garments of the condemned, or tend to instruments used in punishment. Some managed the collection of fees or the care of livestock granted in payment. These contributions, though less visible, tied them firmly to the craft. A wife did not wield the sword, but her labor was interwoven with the life that her husband's duty created. She too bore the silent scorn of neighbors for deeds not of her making. Children learned early that the world beyond their homes was not welcoming. They were mocked in markets, denied entry into guilds, and pushed to the edge of play by other children. Their future was bound to their father's profession, whether through continuation of the role or by the taint of association. Few trades opened to them, and the cycle of exclusion was passed from cradle to grave. Innocence was burdened with the weight of a name. In some towns, authorities acknowledged the difficulty faced by these families. They provided housing or exemptions to ease their hardship, but these measures never removed the social wall built around them. A daughter may be clothed more finely than her peers, but wealth could not purchase acceptance. Even prosperity served as another mark of suspicion, as though their comfort was stolen from the misery of others. Material support never translated into belonging. Women of these families lived with an endurance seldom recorded in chronicles. Their voices, rarely preserved in writing, echoed through the quiet resilience of keeping households together under constant rejection. They managed homes built near gallows, raised children fated to bear a heavy name, and maintained dignity where none was offered by society. Their silence was not weakness but survival, a testimony to strength hidden in the corners of history. The generational impact of this burden shaped entire lineages. Families like the Sansons in France or the Reichards in Germany became known not as individuals, but as bloodlines of executioners. Wives and daughters within these houses carried the same invisible brand, their lives mapped out by decisions made long before their birth. History remembers the men for their craft, yet the women bore equal weight, carrying the curse of association without voice or recognition. Thus, the families of executioners lived as extensions of the scaffold itself. Women endured its shadow in silence, children bore its mark in scorn, and entire households became symbols of both necessity and disgrace. Their lives remind us that stigma does not rest on one pair of shoulders, but spreads across generations. In their unrecorded endurance lies another side of justice's toll, one measured not in executions, but in the daily exile of those bound by kinship to the hand of death. The homes granted to executioners were unlike those of ordinary townsfolk. Municipal councils often provided dwellings, not out of generosity, but to keep these families apart from the rest of the community. Such houses stood on the edge of towns, near gallows fields or execution meadows, where their grim duties were carried out. Proximity to death defined their surroundings, and the landscape itself reinforced their exclusion. These quarters served as both gift and prison, anchoring them in places no one else desired to live. Their dwellings were sometimes larger than those of peasants, for the work required storage of tools and space for livestock given as payment. Yet no matter how spacious, the air of stigma lingered over their walls. Neighbors rarely visited, and the laughter of children seldom echoed there from outside. To dwell in such a house was to know comfort laced with solitude, a hearth burning bright but seldom shared with guests. Shelter came at the cost of belonging. Architecture varied with region, but the symbolism remained. In German towns, executioners' houses were often built close to city gates, ensuring they were visible to travelers entering or leaving. In France, their quarters sometimes adjoined the prison or the place of justice. Placement itself reminded all who passed that justice stood nearby, embodied in the figure who lived within. His home was both residence and symbol, marking the thin line between law and fear. These spaces often doubled as workshops. Swords, ropes, irons, and wheels required care, and the executioner maintained them within his home. Wives and children might assist in cleaning tools, preparing ropes, or storing goods seized from the condemned. The quarters became not only shelter, but also the unseen backstage of public justice, where instruments of death were readied for their next use. Each dwelling thus held the silent echo of countless lives it had prepared to end. Gardens and small fields sometimes surrounded these homes, providing food for the family and a sense of ordinary life amid their isolation. Chickens scratched in the dust, and cows grazed in pastures nearby, yet the shadow of the scaffold stood ever close. Even in these simple labours, stigma followed them. A market might buy their produce reluctantly or avoid it altogether, fearing contamination by association. The soil they tilled bore crops, but also the invisible weight of suspicion. Records from Nuremberg and Strasbourg mention executioners' houses specifically in civic documents, showing how deliberately these spaces were set apart. They were part of the city's structure, yet never within its heart. In some cases, the houses included special gates or paths to gallows sites, ensuring that the condemned could be led directly from prison to execution ground. The executioner's dwelling thus became a point of passage, a silent station on the journey from life to death. For the families who lived within them, these homes were both protection and boundary. The walls kept them safe from the immediate anger of townsfolk, yet they also enclosed them in a cage of reputation. Children grew up watching the gallows rise outside their doors, reminded daily of the profession that defined their lives. Within these quarters, family life was carried on with dignity, but always under the weight of separation from the larger community. So the executioner's house stood as more than timber and stone. It was a mark upon the landscape, a visible reminder of justice's harsh edge and of society's contradictions. Provided by the very people who despised him, it offered both necessity and exclusion. In its walls were hearths and families, but also the echoes of solitude and duty. To live there was to embody the paradox of the age, essential to law, yet forever dwelling at its margins. No execution was carried out without ceremony. Justice in the Middle Ages was as much about the ritual as about the punishment itself. From the moment sentence was passed, a path unfolded marked by prayers, proclamations, and processions. The condemned was not hurried to the scaffold, but led through a series of acts designed to remind both him and the onlookers of the weight of law and the presence of God. Each gesture bound the execution to something greater than the single life it ended. The journey often began in prison, where priests visited the condemned, urging repentance and confession. Words of absolution were offered, sometimes accepted, sometimes resisted. This spiritual preparation was part of the ritual, ensuring that death was framed not only as a legal matter, but as a passage of the soul. Executioners themselves stood silently in these moments, waiting to perform their role once faith had spoken. It was a reminder that justice claimed both body and spirit. On the day itself, the condemned was paraded through the streets. This march was not meant only for punishment, but for instruction. Townsfolk watched from windows, mothers held children close, merchants paused their work to stare. Officials carried banners or proclamations, announcing crimes aloud. The procession became a sermon in motion, teaching all who saw it that disobedience bore a visible cost. At its center walked the figure who would soon stand before the crowd in finality. At the sight of death, ritual deepened. A herald read the sentence publicly, priests recited prayers, and often the condemned was allowed to speak last words. Some begged forgiveness, others proclaimed innocence, and a few met their fate in silence. The crowd absorbed each word, remembering long afterward the final moments of those who passed. The scaffold became more than wood and rope. It was a stage where justice, faith, and mortality converged in solemn drama. The executioner was not free to act at whim. He was bound to perform his task at the right moment, often waiting for prayers to end or signals to be given. In some regions, the striking of a church bell marked the instant of death. In others, officials raised hands to signify readiness. His task was therefore not only technical but ceremonial, his timing as important as his skill. He was the final actor, but his cue belonged to others. Clothing, too, held ritual meaning. Condemned nobles were sometimes dressed in white shirts, symbolizing purity sought in their last hour. Heretics were clothed in distinctive garments marked with symbols of fire or devils, declaring their crimes to all. The executioner himself might wear red to signify blood and justice, though more often he dressed plainly. Each garment contributed to the message, turning the execution into a performance etched with symbolism as well as reality. Music and bells were sometimes present, heightening the gravity of the moment. Hymns were sung for the condemned, reminding the living of divine mercy even in judgment. The tolling of bells marked the passage from life to death, echoing over rooftops and fields. For the community, these sounds fixed the event in memory, carrying the ritual beyond the scaffold itself. Even those not present could hear the notes that signaled justice had been fulfilled. These ceremonies remind us that executions were never only about ending a life. They were woven into the spiritual and social fabric of the time, binding law to faith and community through ritual. The executioner, though reviled, was an essential part of this order, ensuring that the solemn rhythm was completed. Through these acts, justice was transformed into spectacle and death into a ritual of meaning. Such was the way medieval society gave form to its harshest truths. The scaffold demanded precision, yet even the most skilled hand could falter. A sword too dull, an arm too weary, or a rope poorly tied could turn justice into chaos. When such failures occurred, the executioner bore the full fury of the crowd. Anger rose not only from sympathy for the condemned, but from the belief that law itself had been dishonored. A botched execution became a scar upon the community, remembered long after the body had been carried away. Accounts tell of beheadings where several blows were needed before life ended. Each strike deepened the shame, for the people expected swiftness as proof of justice's strength. Failure brought jeers, curses, and sometimes violence against the very man tasked with fulfilling the sentence. To falter before so many eyes was to risk ruin of reputation. For once the crowd lost faith in the executioner, his authority, and even his safety, dwindled rapidly. Hangings, too, could go awry. A rope might snap, or the drop prove too short, leaving the condemned gasping in prolonged agony. In some cases, those who survived initial failure were pardoned, as if divine will had intervened. Yet more often, the executioner was forced to attempt again, bearing the shame of prolonging the suffering he was meant to end. The gallows became a place not only of death, but of humiliation for the man who miscalculated. Even fire, the element most certain, could betray expectation. Damp wood might smoulder instead of blaze, leaving the condemned writhing in smoke rather than swiftly consumed. Crowds, unsettled by the sight, turned their anger upon the executioner and officials alike. Such scenes eroded the intended message of justice, turning what should have been orderly punishment into scenes of horror that unsettled faith in the system itself. The psychological toll of such moments weighed heavily. Executioners knew that one failure could undo years of careful service. The eyes of the town judged harshly, and whispers followed long after, branding him incompetent or cursed. In records left by men like Franz Schmidt, the burden of precision is evident, his notes marked with concern for each strike's outcome. Behind his steady hand lay the constant dread of dishonor should he falter. Authorities were not blind to these risks. Some towns required executioners to test their swords publicly, striking animals or blocks of wood to assure sharpness before a noble beheading. This practice sought to prevent failure, but also displayed the seriousness of the task. The executioner became accountable not only to the law, but to the performance of skill, his tools and body scrutinized as part of the ceremony itself. Yet no amount of preparation could silence the unpredictability of death. Bodies differed, circumstances shifted, and the human hand was never infallible. Each execution carried the chance of error, and with it, the possibility of disgrace. The executioner lived knowing that his craft allowed no forgiveness for mistakes, even though he was despised for carrying it out at all. His life was bound to a cruel balance between precision and the wrath of the crowd. Thus, failures became moments when the fragile authority of medieval justice revealed its cracks. A botched stroke or broken rope turned order into disorder, exposing the limits of both man and law. For the executioner, these failures were more than technical missteps. They were threats to survival, reputation, and livelihood. His burden was not only the weight of death, but the demand to carry it out flawlessly, under the watchful and unforgiving eyes of all. Every town bore its place of death, a space chosen not in secrecy, but with deliberate visibility. These were often hillsides, meadows, or crossroads where travelers passed daily. To see gallows rising against the horizon was to be reminded that law reached beyond walls and markets. The ground itself became part of civic identity, a grim landmark known to all who lived nearby. These sites spoke with silent authority, warning strangers and citizens alike of the power held by those who ruled. In many German towns, these areas were called Galgenberg, or Gallows Hill, raised high so that bodies might be seen from afar. England too had its Tyburn, where countless lives ended beneath the gaze of London's multitudes. Such places were not hidden away, but integrated into the geography of daily life. Roads passed them, fields surrounded them, and shepherds grazed flocks in their shadow. They were reminders that justice was not confined to parchment, but etched into earth and sky. These sites often had permanent structures, wooden gallows, stone platforms, or iron cages where corpses hung long after execution. Some displayed the remains of traitors or thieves for weeks, allowing decay itself to deliver the message of deterrence. Travelers approaching a city first saw its cathedral towers, then its gallows, symbols of salvation and punishment side by side. The execution ground thus stood as a threshold into civic order, a boundary where power declared itself unmistakably. Over time, the soil of these fields grew heavy with memory. Countless bodies were buried beneath or left unclaimed nearby, denied consecrated ground by the church. Executioners themselves often oversaw these burials, placing the dead in shallow pits or marking the land with little more than stones. The earth became a palimpsest of justice, layered with the remains of those who had crossed the line of law. Generations passed, yet the ground itself seemed to hold the echoes of cries once heard there. The sites also served as stages for political theatre. Rebels and traitors were executed in places of high visibility, their corpses quartered and displayed across regions. Hills and crossroads multiplied the message, ensuring that no one could mistake the reach of authority. The executioner played his role within this landscape, but it was the geography itself that amplified the terror. To journey past such places was to feel the gaze of law, even in silence. Not all regarded these grounds with fear alone. Some treated them as ordinary landmarks, arranging markets or fairs nearby. Children, too young to grasp their meaning, played in the fields where gallows stood. Life and death mingled strangely in these spaces, reflecting the way medieval people lived closely with mortality. Though dreaded, the gallows fields became part of the rhythm of the town, both feared and accepted as inevitable features of civic life. Chroniclers often describe these sites in detail, for they embodied the moral lessons of their age. To them, Gallows Hill was not only a place of punishment, but a sermon in earth and timber. Every passerby was its congregation, reminded that sin and crime bore visible consequence. The executioner's work lingered there long after he departed, the structures themselves preaching obedience. These fields thus became unspoken texts, written not with ink, but with bodies and wood. So it was that execution grounds became more than soil. They were living symbols of medieval order. They stood at the meeting of life and law, sacred and profane, terror and routine. To walk past them was to feel both fear and resignation, for they declared that justice never slept. In the memory of these hills and meadows lies a truth. That authority made itself known not only through rulers and courts, but through the silent presence of wood raised high against the sky. The man behind the sword was never allowed to vanish into anonymity. Though despised, his figure was unmistakable in the life of a town. Everyone knew his face, his gait, his dwelling on the outskirts, and the path he walked to the gallows. His presence evoked both fascination and dread, for he was the visible reminder of justice's harshest edge. To the public eye, he became less an individual than a symbol, his identity inseparable from his office. Some executioners leaned into this notoriety, carrying themselves with solemn authority. They understood that fear could shield them from mockery, just as precision could win them a measure of respect. Others chose silence, avoiding crowds whenever possible, enduring stares without word or reply. In both cases, their existence was a spectacle, whether they sought it or not. The very fact of their survival required them to navigate carefully between the roles of outcast and enforcer. There were instances where fame followed their work. Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, for example, left detailed records of his executions, preserving both his duties and his longing for redemption. His meticulous journals gave him a voice that outlived his own time, transforming him from faceless figure into historical witness. Through such accounts, the executioner's public persona became not only a reflection of society's fear, but also a mirror of his own humanity. Yet this public recognition never lifted the weight of stigma. He might be respected for skill, but he was never embraced as neighbor or brother. Tavern doors closed to him, guilds barred his entry, and the church often held him at arm's length. The contradiction was sharp. Society relied on him absolutely, yet refused him belonging. His face was remembered not for kindness, but for the shadow of death it carried. At times, curiosity softened contempt. Some townspeople came to him for healing or remedies, speaking with the very man they avoided in daylight. In these moments, his public persona shifted slightly, from instrument of death to reluctant healer. Still, secrecy cloaked such interactions, for none wished to be seen too closely associated with him. His identity remained fractured, built of layers of necessity, silence, and whispered recognition. Public expectation weighed heavily on him. Each execution became a performance where failure meant disgrace, not only in skill but in reputation. Crowds measured his worth by the cleanness of a stroke, the steadiness of his hand, the absence of hesitation. A single falter could follow him for years, spoken of in markets and taverns long after. Thus, his persona was shaped not by choice, but by the eyes that judged him mercilessly. Some communities treated him with a mixture of fear and reluctant esteem. They might mock his name, yet acknowledge his courage, for few would dare bear such a burden. In rare cases, executioners became figures of dark legend, their names retold in stories that blurred truth and myth. They lived not as ordinary men, but as embodiments of justice's cruelty, woven into the cultural memory of the age. In the end, the public persona of the executioner was never his own to define. It was shaped by law, by ritual, and by the countless eyes that watched him work. He walked through life as both man and symbol, burdened with the contradictions of necessity and rejection. Through him, medieval society projected its fears, its authority, and its unease, leaving him forever caught between recognition and exile. Contrary to the dark images carried by later imagination, medieval executioners rarely hid their faces. The hood, so common in stories and plays, was more invention than truth. Most dressed in plain garments suited to their work, practical for handling blades, ropes, and fire. Their appearance was not theatrical, but functional, reflecting the everyday reality of a man whose task required steadiness rather than disguise. What marked them was not costume, but recognition. Their faces were already known to all. In some regions, however, laws required distinctive clothing. Certain German cities ordered executioners to wear garments dyed red, a color symbolizing both blood and justice. Red cloaks or tunics became silent markers, setting them apart as visible servants of law. These clothes bore no glamour, only stigma, for the color reminded all of the role they played. Wherever they walked, the fabric announced their presence, ensuring none could mistake them for ordinary citizens. Executioners also bore tools openly when called to their duty. Swords, axes, or branding irons served as symbols of their station, carried with the same gravity as a knight might carry arms. These objects, more than clothing, defined their appearance in public eyes. The crowd expected to see the blade gleaming or the rope ready, for these instruments gave physical form to justice. The executioner's appearance was thus inseparable from the tools he carried. Physical strength shaped the impression they left. Many were broad of shoulder and firm of hand, for their craft demanded endurance. Yet it was not muscle alone that defined them, but the composure with which they stood before the multitude. Their bearing conveyed a steadiness that was part of their unspoken uniform. To falter in posture was to falter in authority. and so executioners learned to hold themselves with grave solemnity, however heavy their inner burden. Descriptions from chronicles sometimes mention their hair cropped short or beards left unshaven, details that underscored their difference from guildmasters or merchants. These small marks of distinction reflected the outsider status they carried. They were not men of fashion or display, but figures of necessity. Their appearance dictated more by exclusion than by choice. To be seen as rough or unkempt was almost expected, a physical mirror of the disdain they endured. Still, exceptions existed. Some executioners, especially in larger cities, cultivated dignity in appearance to counter the scorn they faced. Well-kept clothing, polished boots, and carefully tended swords could lend them an air of professionalism. These efforts did little to erase stigma, but allowed them to assert pride in their craft. In such details, they sought to claim respect where none was offered freely, dressing themselves not in secrecy, but in the seriousness of their role. The image of the hooded figure persisted more in imagination than reality, finding its roots in later tales and plays. The truth of their appearance was simpler, bound to function, law, and the public gaze. Their clothing declared them marked men. Their tools defined their purpose, and their bodies carried the strength of their craft. They were recognizable not by masks, but by the inevitability they represented. So it was that executioners walked unhidden among the people, yet never as one of them. Their appearance, whether plain or marked by law, set them apart as visible reminders of authority's final edge. They had no need for disguise, for their presence was already unmistakable. Through clothing, bearing, and tools, they carried the weight of justice on their very bodies, visible to all, yet embraced by none. Though their work was tied to solemnity and fear, executioners sometimes crossed unexpectedly into the realm of entertainment. Festivals and fairs occasionally invited them to display feats of strength, swinging heavy blades, or demonstrating control of weapons. Crowds that scorned them in daily life watched with fascination when skill was shown outside the scaffold. In such moments, their grim profession blurred with spectacle, turning necessity into performance. The line between justice and amusement became thinner than one might imagine. In certain regions, executioners were asked to stage mock combats, testing their swords against targets or demonstrating precision before a crowd. These displays reinforced the fear of their strength while cloaking it in theatrical form. The same steady hand that ended lives became a source of curious admiration. Children stared wide-eyed, while adults, half in awe and half in dread, measured the man's mastery. What was usually hidden beneath stigma emerged briefly as spectacle. Public fascination with violence gave rise to such invitations. Just as executions drew throngs, so too did demonstrations of the tools and skill behind them. The executioner's presence guaranteed attention, for his name alone carried a sense of forbidden allure. He was both despised and captivating, a figure society rejected yet could not look away from. In this paradox, entertainment became another stage upon which his life was reluctantly performed. There were also darker intersections of justice and spectacle. At times, criminals were forced to perform humiliating acts before their execution, turning the scaffold itself into a theatre. The executioner managed these displays, ensuring order while allowing the crowd its grim satisfaction. He thus became stagemaster as much as punisher, guiding not only the blow, but the sequence of events leading to it. Entertainment and death entwined under his watchful presence. Some records speak of executioners called upon to participate in jousts or tournaments, not as equals to knights, but as curiosities. Their role was less noble combatant than performer, wielding strength in ways that amused or unsettled audiences. These appearances were rare, yet they reveal how society both shunned and used them, drawing upon their feared skill whenever spectacle demanded. The man of exile was summoned back into the circle of communal life, if only briefly. In tavern stories and folk songs, executioners sometimes became characters of dark humor, mocked for their trade, but remembered for their presence. Jests about their blades or ropes spread through markets, turning fear into laughter. Though the jokes carried cruelty, they also testified to how deeply ingrained the executioner was in the imagination of the people. His role was never only practical, it echoed in culture, folklore, and the uneasy laughter of the crowd. Entertainment offered a rare chance for executioners to step beyond their stigma, though it was never without cost. Admiration mingled with mockery, applause with suspicion. When the performance ended, they returned once more to isolation, the brief acceptance fading into the usual silence of exile. Their lives remained chained to contradiction, visible in festival joy, but excluded from its fellowship. So it was that the executioner became, at times, both punisher and performer. His strength, feared in one setting, was displayed in another as curiosity. Entertainment did not free him from rejection, but it revealed society's complex fascination with his presence. Through both laughter and fear, the people acknowledged him, never embracing, yet never forgetting the man who embodied justice in flesh and steel. The company an executioner kept was seldom by choice. Shut out from guilds and decent society, he found himself among those already living at the edges. Prostitutes, beggars, and lepers offered the kind of companionship denied him in markets and churches. These gatherings were less about solidarity than survival, a web of outcasts drawn together by exclusion. In their presence, the executioner was not uniquely shunned. He was simply one among many carrying society's disdain. Such connections formed strange communities. The tanner, whose trade with animal hides reeked of impurity, spoke freely with the executioner when others would not. Gravediggers, accustomed to death's constant touch, shared more in common with him than townsmen who bought their bread daily. Even lepers, forced to live apart, echoed his sense of exile. Among these groups, the executioner's name carried less weight of fear, for stigma had already hardened into daily existence. These associations did not erase his burden, but they gave him a measure of belonging. Together, the marginalized built networks of trade, favor, and silent understanding. An executioner might find a wife among these circles, or a drinking companion who did not shrink from his presence. Their lives, though isolated from the heart of town, wove threads of endurance on the outskirts. In exile, they found fragments of fellowship, however fragile. Records hint at this shadow society. In Strasbourg and Nuremberg, executioners were noted as living near brothels or tanners' quarters, not by coincidence, but by deliberate placement. Authorities, in granting them homes, chose spaces already marked by impurity. In doing so, they clustered the unwanted together, forming small neighborhoods where stigma was shared. These quarters stood as silent boundaries between the pure community and those deemed unclean. Within these margins, the executioner's skills sometimes gave him authority. His knowledge of healing or his access to bodies made him useful to the sick or desperate. Beggars might seek his remedies, prostitutes his protection, lepers his assistance in securing supplies. He was both pariah and figure of utility, inhabiting a space where necessity softened hatred. Among the marginalized, survival often mattered more than reputation. This shared exile also deepened his children's inheritance of rejection. Sons and daughters grew up not only under the weight of their father's name, but surrounded by those equally excluded. Their friends were the children of beggars or tanners, not guildmasters or merchants. These bonds shaped generations, binding them to the margins long after their fathers' swords had been laid down. The cycle of exclusion continued in both blood and companionship. In festivals and markets, the divide was plain. The executioner and his companions lingered at the edges, present yet apart, tolerated yet unwelcome. They saw the world of guilds, churches, and councils from a distance, knowing it would never be theirs. Their lives unfolded in a parallel society, woven into the same city yet never fully belonging. This separation marked not only individuals, but entire communities. Thus, the executioner's ties to the marginalized were not accidents, but inevitabilities. His exclusion drove him to those who shared his fate, and together they formed an undercurrent of survival beneath the surface of medieval towns. In their company, he was less alone, though never free of stigma. His life reveals how rejection can bind people together, creating unlikely communities where necessity forged belonging at the edges of society's gaze. When justice claimed a life, the sentence did not end with death. The fate of the body carried its own meaning, shaped by law and belief. Those condemned were often denied burial in consecrated ground, their souls considered tainted by crime or heresy. Instead, their remains were cast into earth near gallows fields or crossroads, places already marked by shame. The executioner, whose duty ended the life, was frequently tasked with disposing of the corpse, sealing the cycle of exclusion even in death. Graves in such places were shallow and unmarked, intended not for remembrance but for erasure. Families of the condemned, when permitted, might beg for the body to give it private rest, though permission was rare. More often, the remains were left to the executioner's hand, hidden in pits or covered with earth so thin that time and weather soon revealed them again. These sites grew heavy with memory, layered with bones of countless forgotten souls. In parts of Germany and France, special cemeteries for criminals were established, known as executioners' fields or potters' fields. These grounds, separated from churchyards, became repositories of the unwanted dead. The executioner managed them, burying bodies without rites, fulfilling law's demand that the condemned not rest among the faithful. The very soil became an emblem of separation, a mirror of the social exile carried by the living executioner himself. There were symbolic practices as well. Bodies of heretics were sometimes burned completely, their ashes scattered to prevent burial altogether. Traitors might be quartered, their remains displayed on city walls or bridges, leaving nothing to inter in one place. These acts ensured that the condemned were denied not only life, but also memory, their absence of a grave a further punishment to both them and their kin. The executioner oversaw these grim processes, bound to the erasure of identity. The Church's involvement in such matters was complicated. While it preached mercy, it also upheld the exclusion of those deemed beyond salvation. Denying burial in holy ground was meant to mark spiritual disgrace as well as social. Yet whispers of pity survived, as some priests secretly prayed for the souls of the condemned, even as their bodies lay outside consecrated soil. Between mercy and law, the executioner stood as the enforcer of silence. For the community, these burials reinforced fear. To see gallows hills scattered with bones, or to pass fields where criminals were interred, reminded all of justice's reach. Children grew up hearing warnings not to wander near such places, where the restless dead were said to linger. Though superstition cloaked these grounds in dread, their power as symbols of law was unmistakable. They marked the boundaries of order, where the unwanted rested apart from the living and the saved. Executioners themselves often bore the stain of handling these burials. To touch the dead was seen as unclean, and when the dead were criminals, the impurity deepened. Yet he had no choice, for the same hand that carried out the sentence was expected to dispose of the remains. His life was entwined with the condemned, even after death, binding him to a duty no one else would accept. Each grave dug was another step into solitude. In the end, the burial of the condemned revealed the harshness of medieval justice. Death did not restore equality, nor did it erase stigma. Instead, it extended punishment into the grave, leaving bodies to rest in fields of shame. The executioner's role in this task was another mark of his own exclusion, a man forever tied to those cast out by law. In their burial, he too was reminded of his place, necessary, despised, and bound to the margins of both life and death. In times of peace, their duties did not end with the scaffold. Executioners were often charged with tending to the dead more broadly, for society placed this task in the same realm of impurity as their official office. They became gravediggers for the unwanted, laying to rest those denied churchyards or abandoned by families. The soil of their hands, stained with death in one form, continued its work in another. They lived as custodians of the boundary between the living and the departed. The plague years made this role all the more necessary. When pestilence swept through towns and corpses filled the streets, executioners and their assistants were called upon to clear them. Fear of contagion kept others away, but the already shunned were pressed into this labor. They dug pits by the dozen, lowering bodies in haste, while priests murmured distant prayers. The weight of death grew unbearable, yet it fell upon them to bear it when no one else would. Handling the dead, whether criminal or innocent, deepened the stigma surrounding them. In an age when purity and pollution shaped much of communal life, touching corpses marked one as unclean. The executioner thus carried impurity upon impurity, bound not only to blood, but to rot. Townsfolk recoiled at his presence, yet relied on him to perform the very tasks they feared most. His life was one of constant contradiction, despised even as he rendered indispensable service. Some records note payment for such duties, meager sums granted for every body buried. In certain towns, executioners were permitted to claim clothing or possessions of the dead as part of their wage. Though such rewards sustained their families, they also reinforced the image of men profiting from death. Wealth gained in this way carried no honor, only suspicion, and the executioner's household bore the scorn that followed. Survival came at the cost of deeper exclusion. The tools of his trade as gravedigger were simple: spades, carts, ropes for hauling the dead. Yet these humble objects bound him more tightly to his role. Just as his axe or sword symbolized justice, his shovel came to represent his association with death itself. Whether raising a gallows or opening earth for a mass grave, he worked with the same inevitability. His life was measured in burials, whether by judgment of law or necessity of plague. Communities sometimes tried to balance this dependence with restrictions. Executioners were ordered to live near burial fields, separated from ordinary dwellings, ensuring their presence remained at the margins. In this way, their quarters became both home and cemetery, with the dead their closest neighbors. Children grew up playing among graves, families dining within sight of gallows and pits. Life and death were fused in ways unthinkable for most, but unavoidable for those bound to this calling. Their role in burials also linked them unexpectedly to the sacred. Priests might avoid direct contact with plague victims, but executioners stepped forward when none else dared. In this service, they preserved the living by removing the dead, offering a form of protection seldom acknowledged. Their labor, while scorned, was an act of necessity that shielded communities from further ruin. It was mercy hidden within rejection, a grim gift seldom recognized. Thus, the executioner's duty as gravedigger reveals the full breadth of his burden. He was not merely the hand that struck at justice's command, but the one who bore death in all its forms. Whether burying criminals in shame or victims of plague in haste, he became the keeper of society's darkest moments. His spade and his sword alike marked him as servant of law and custodian of mortality, forever bound to a life lived at the edge of both necessity and scorn. When the spectre of witchcraft spread across Europe, the executioner became central to its terrible machinery. Accusations rose in villages and towns, and courts demanded confessions to confirm their fears. It was the executioner who oversaw the torture chambers, tightening ropes, lifting bodies on the strappado, or stretching limbs upon the rack. His hands were guided not by personal will, but by the authority of magistrates and inquisitors, who believed suffering could unmask the devil's servants. Through him, suspicion became agony, and agony became proof. The burning stake was the most infamous of these sentences. Once the court declared guilt, it was the executioner who built the pyre, bound the condemned, and set flame to wood. Crowds assembled not only for justice, but for spectacle, believing they watched evil itself consumed in fire. Yet behind the smoke stood the man who struck no sermon, who carried no scripture, but who performed the last, merciless act. His task gave visible form to the fears that haunted Christendom. Women bore the greatest weight of these trials, though men too were accused. Healers, widows, and those who stood apart from community life often found themselves named. The executioner, though often silent, became the figure through whom society's anxieties were enacted. He did not choose the victims, yet he carried out the sentence. In his work, centuries of fear toward the unknown were turned into ash and bone. The body made sacrifice to collective dread. The procedures were steeped in ritual. Condemned witches were sometimes paraded through town, their garments marked with symbols of devils or fire. Priests urged repentance, while magistrates proclaimed the law. At the center of it all, the executioner prepared his tools: the rope, the chain, the fire. His role was mechanical yet indispensable, ensuring that the ritual unfolded in order and that the town saw evil defeated, at least for a fleeting moment. The torture chamber demanded a grim expertise. The executioner had to apply pain in increments, drawing confessions without causing death too swiftly. He was taught by experience how far flesh could endure before collapse. Under his hands, words were wrenched from trembling lips, often confirming what courts demanded to hear. These confessions, however forced, became the foundation for further accusations, weaving the net of fear tighter. Thus, his role was not only in punishment, but in sustaining the cycle itself. Records from German territories and France show the immense reliance upon these men during the height of the witch hunts. Without them, the elaborate rituals of interrogation and execution could not proceed. Some became notorious for their efficiency, carrying out multiple burnings in a single day. Yet their names, even when recorded, were seldom remembered with honor. They stood as shadows behind the stage of hysteria, visible only when fire lit the sky. The church and secular courts alike bore responsibility for these trials, but it was the executioner who enacted their verdicts. His presence embodied the uneasy alliance between fear, law, and faith. He became the instrument by which society sought to purge itself of imagined corruption. In the ashes of countless pyres, his duty was etched, though he carried none of the power that set those fires in motion. He was servant, not judge, yet bore equal scorn. So the witch trials reveal another facet of his existence. Not merely punisher of criminals, but agent of collective terror. He carried out sentences shaped by fear, suspicion, and zeal, turning accusation into death. His life was bound not only to justice, but to the darker impulses of the age, where law blurred with hysteria. In his silence lies a witness to one of Europe's most haunting chapters, where the scaffold and the stake consumed more than flesh. They consumed reason itself. Though their lives appear in records as duties fulfilled and sentences carried out, behind the ink lay a human cost rarely spoken of. The executioner lived daily with the knowledge that his hands ended lives, that his craft was bound to suffering. He might perform his tasks with precision, yet the memory of eyes staring back at him, of voices pleading or cursing in final moments, could not easily be erased. Beneath the silence demanded of him, sorrow grew heavy. Some men sought relief through faith. Confession to priests, though hesitant and sometimes refused, offered moments of solace. Others prayed privately, hoping for absolution from sins they felt pressed upon their souls, even as they acted under law's command. Executioners like Franz Schmidt left behind writings filled with yearning for redemption, their words revealing not cruelty, but regret. They longed for forgiveness not from men, but from God, whose judgment they feared more than the crowd's contempt. Alcohol became a refuge for many, dulling the sharpness of memory. Taverns, though places of mockery, also offered escape from the weight of their work. Yet drink provided only fleeting relief, and the morning always returned with the same burden. The laughter of others rarely lightened the executioner's heart, for he remained marked by the knowledge that he could not step away from his calling. Escape, even in intoxication, was only ever temporary. the burden extended into families. Wives shared their husbands' shame, but also their weariness, tending to men who carried invisible scars. Children grew up beneath the shadow of grief as well as stigma, their fathers silent at table, haunted by what their eyes had seen. Stories of executioners show men living long lives, but seldom peaceful ones. The work aged them beyond their years, carving heaviness into their faces and solitude into their souls. It is striking how rarely executioners expressed pride in their office. Though they might accept its necessity, most accounts speak more of endurance than of satisfaction. The role was a service to law, not a source of identity they embraced. Their humanity remained intact, but pressed down by the conflict between duty and conscience. To strike with steel may have been practiced, but to carry the memory of it was never mastered. The people who scorned them seldom recognized this hidden cost. To the crowd, the executioner was a figure of cruelty, detached and cold. Yet the truth was often more complex. A man performing tasks demanded by others, bearing the guilt they refused to carry. The loneliness imposed upon him deepened this weight, for there were few willing to hear his grief, fewer still willing to comfort it. Silence became his only companion. Even when skilled, the executioner could not shield himself from nightmares. The faces of those condemned returned in restless dreams, the cries echoing beyond the scaffold. The more years passed, the more these memories accumulated, heavy as stones upon the heart. It was a burden unique to this profession, unseen by chroniclers who noted only numbers, not the quiet suffering of the man who fulfilled them. His humanity, though cloaked, endured beneath the shadow of his craft, so the emotional weight of this duty must be remembered. The executioner was not merely hand of justice, but a man who bore wounds invisible to the world. His legacy was not only measured in deaths recorded, but in the silent grief carried until his own final breath. In him, we see how law can demand more than labor. It can demand a soul's endurance, binding a man to sorrow as surely as to the scaffold. When kingdoms marched to war, the executioner's craft did not rest at home. Armies carried with them laws as strict as those in cities, and discipline was enforced with the same harsh edge. Desertion, theft, and treason demanded swift punishment, and it was the executioner who was summoned to enact it. He became not only servant of towns and courts, but also of commanders, ensuring that order did not falter in the chaos of battle. On campaign, gallows were raised in fields, sometimes within sight of marching soldiers. The sight of comrades hanged for desertion or mutiny struck fear into the ranks, a visible reminder that discipline could not be broken even amidst war. Executioners traveled with armies, carrying their tools across muddy roads and bloodied landscapes. They were outsiders among soldiers, yet necessary for commanders who relied on fear as much as courage to hold their forces together. Records from the 100 Years' War and other conflicts mention punishments overseen by these men. Spies caught within camps faced swift death, often by hanging or beheading, their bodies displayed as warnings. Looters who plundered without permission were flogged or executed, for unchecked violence threatened alliances and supplies. In this way, the executioner became part of the machinery of war, ensuring that authority extended even into fields of battle. The duality of their role deepened in such times. They were surrounded by killing, yet their killings were different, sanctioned not as acts of war, but as judgments within it. Soldiers who fell in battle were honored, while those slain by the executioner bore shame. This distinction reinforced the boundaries of order amidst chaos, marking him once more as the figure who separated lawful death from dishonorable crime. War also heightened the dangers of their work. Crowds of armed men could turn violent if they felt justice mishandled. A botched execution in a military camp risked riot as surely as in a town square, but with swords already drawn. The executioner lived with the same fear of reprisal, perhaps even sharper, for the soldiers he punished had comrades close at hand. His life in camp was one of constant vigilance and isolation. Payment for these duties varied. Some were granted extra wages from the commander's treasury, while others received spoils of war in place of coin. Like at home, the executioner's material needs were met, yet his social position remained unchanged. Soldiers tolerated his presence but seldom welcomed him into their fellowship. He was as alone in camp as he was in the city, a necessary but unwelcome figure wherever authority required him. In some accounts, executioners themselves were pressed into ordinary combat when armies thinned. They fought not as knights or respected men-at-arms, but as expendable figures who could be placed in the fray. Their lives were doubly burdened, despised in camp and endangered in battle. Yet, when discipline again called for punishment, they returned to their grim duties, shifting from soldier back to servant of the gallows. Thus, even in war, the executioner bore the same contradictions that defined his life in peace. He was indispensable for maintaining order, yet never embraced by those he served. His sword and rope moved from towns to battlefields, carrying the authority of law into the very heart of chaos. In his shadowed role, we see how deeply society depended on him, in times of both peace and strife, yet how little it granted in return beyond scorn and solitude. Though executioners often earned more than peasants and sometimes matched the income of craftsmen, their wealth rarely lifted them from disdain. They might own sturdy homes, fine clothing, or even parcels of land, yet these possessions did not translate into honor. Neighbors continued to avoid their company, guilds barred their entry, and churches relegated them to the margins. Material comfort stood side by side with social exile, making their lives a strange balance of prosperity and rejection. Payment could be generous, especially in large cities where executions were frequent. Beyond coin, executioners sometimes received land rights, tax exemptions, or goods seized from criminals. Families thus enjoyed security unknown to most commoners. Their children could be clothed well, their tables set with food beyond the simple fare of bread and broth. Yet this prosperity remained enclosed within walls, for no banquet invitation or guild feast welcomed them. Their wealth was private, never public. The contradiction grew sharper as their success became more visible. A well-kept house on the town's edge reminded citizens of the trade that sustained it. The more prosperous the family, the more their prosperity was tied to misery in the minds of others. Some whispered that their comfort was stolen from the suffering of the condemned, as if blood itself had been turned into coin. In this way, wealth deepened suspicion rather than dissolving it. Marriage prospects were shaped by this paradox as well. Though executioners could offer stability and land, respectable families rarely agreed to unions. The stigma of their name outweighed the comfort they could provide. Thus, they married within their own circle or among other despised trades, passing wealth along hereditary lines. Prosperity preserved them, but it also chained them, locking them into a caste of necessity that remained apart from ordinary society. There were rare exceptions, moments when wealth offered limited influence. Some towns sought executioners' loans in times of need, borrowing coin from the very men they scorned. Others accepted gifts of healing remedies or food during famine, quietly thankful while publicly aloof. These acts showed how wealth could create small breaches in the wall of stigma. Yet once the crisis passed, the executioner returned to the shadows, his generosity quickly forgotten. Children of such families felt the contradiction most keenly. They grew up in houses better furnished than many, yet they walked streets lined with ridicule. Dressed in clothing finer than their peers, they remained outcasts, mocked for the name they bore. Wealth could not purchase belonging. It merely sharpened the contrast between what they owned and what they lacked. Security without acceptance was a hollow form of privilege, felt keenly with every closed door. Historical records describe executioners who retired with substantial property, even leaving estates to their descendants. Yet these legacies carried the same mark as their profession. A son might inherit land, but not respect. A daughter might receive dowry, but not honor. The shadow of the scaffold clung to every coin, every acre. Prosperity without esteem proved a fragile inheritance, unable to erase the disdain woven into their very identity. So it was that wealth became both shield and chain. It sustained their families, providing food, land, and comfort beyond the reach of many, yet it never opened the gates of acceptance. The executioner's prosperity was real but hollow, carried always with the reminder that society saw not the man's fortune, but the blood from which it flowed. In this paradox of wealth versus reputation lies one of the deepest ironies of his life: prosperous in body, impoverished in spirit. In an era where doctors were scarce and expensive, executioners often became unlikely guardians of health. They learned to set bones, treat wounds, and prepare herbal remedies, skills developed from handling bodies and observing the effects of pain. People whispered of their knowledge, seeking them in secret when illness struck. Though publicly shunned, privately they were healers, moving quietly between the worlds of death and survival. Their remedies drew from both tradition and necessity. Herbal salves eased burns, potions reduced fevers, and poultices soothed infections. Some learned by watching physicians, others by trial with condemned bodies, testing how flesh responded to certain plants. It was a grim education, but one that bore results. Those who could not afford physicians often turned to the executioner, exchanging coins or goods for healing hands. Yet trust remained fragile. Many feared the duality of their role. The same man who could mend a limb could also sever it. This contradiction gave rise to suspicion that their cures contained curses. To receive medicine from an executioner was to walk the edge between gratitude and dread. Patients recovered, but stories spread of potions brewed with sinister intent, blurring the line between healer and poisoner. Legends flourished around their knowledge. Some towns believed executioners held secrets of poisons so subtle they could kill without a trace. Others claimed they could summon remedies beyond ordinary science, powers drawn from their dealings with death. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales deepened their aura of danger. Healing and harming became inseparable in the popular imagination, binding them to both fear and fascination. Historical records note instances where executioners sold herbal mixtures openly, even competing with apothecaries. In some regions, towns granted them the right to practice minor medicine as part of their office. This odd legitimacy coexisted with rejection, allowing them to prosper economically but never socially. The healer's robe never covered the executioner's shadow, and each act of kindness remained tinged with suspicion. The contradiction extended to their own families. Wives and children benefited from remedies that kept them healthier than neighbours, yet they too bore the stigma. A son might carry knowledge of herbs, but his lineage branded him suspect. A daughter might know how to soothe fever, but her skill was overshadowed by whispers of witchcraft. Even within their own homes, healing was double-edged, protective and dangerous at once. Communities found themselves trapped in this paradox. They mocked the executioner in daylight, yet sought his remedies under night's cover. The secrecy surrounding these visits only reinforced the myth of forbidden knowledge. To admit being healed by him was shameful, yet to deny his usefulness was folly. Thus, gratitude was masked by silence, leaving the healer's gift unacknowledged, his service erased from public memory. This strange union of care and fear ensured that executioners remained liminal figures. They occupied the threshold between life and death, salvation and damnation, healing and harm. Their remedies cured bodies, but their reputation poisoned their souls in the eyes of others. In the end, their role as both healer and poisoner reflected the ambiguity of their entire existence. Needed, mistrusted, and forever caught between reverence and revulsion. Every instrument in the executioner's arsenal carried both purpose and symbolism. The axe, with its broad blade, was designed for swift decapitation, though success depended on strength and precision. Swords were used in certain regions, considered more honorable for nobles sentenced to death. Ropes for hanging required careful knots and sturdy beams, ensuring a fatal drop rather than a lingering struggle. Each tool became an extension of the executioner's authority, feared and recognized by all. Beyond the familiar, other devices revealed grim ingenuity. The wheel, upon which bodies were broken, displayed the power of punishment as much as its cruelty. Branding irons scorched both flesh and reputation, marking criminals for life. Chains and shackles were crafted not just to restrain, but to humiliate through public display. Even mundane tools, like knives for quartering or hooks for display, took on darker meaning in the hands of the executioner. These objects were more than mere implements. They embodied the law itself. Villagers who saw them trembled, understanding that justice was not abstract but brutally material. The polished blade glinting in sunlight or the creak of a rope in the wind was enough to silence crowds. By their presence alone, these tools maintained order, reminding people that authority was ever present and merciless. Maintaining the instruments was as important as wielding them. Blades had to be sharpened regularly, ropes checked for fraying, and wood repaired after repeated use. An unprepared tool could lead to botched executions, bringing shame and anger upon the executioner. Thus he became part craftsman, part caretaker of death, responsible for ensuring precision in a role where failure was unforgivable. Crafting these tools often involved collaboration with blacksmiths, carpenters, and rope makers. While these artisans provided the raw materials, the executioner customized them to fit his hand and method. A blade balanced to his swing or a rope tied to his specifications meant greater control. This partnership blurred lines of complicity. Those who forged the tools shared, however indirectly, in the weight of the sentence carried out. Superstitions surrounded the objects, granting them power beyond their physical form. Some believed the axe absorbed the souls of those it struck, while ropes from hangings were stolen and sold as charms. Pieces of executioners' tools became relics, used in folk remedies or occult practices. What began as symbols of law transformed into instruments of fear, fascination, and sometimes profit in the hands of common folk. For the executioner himself, these tools were both livelihood and burden. He depended on them for his trade, yet they tied him to a life few envied. Cleaning a blade or coiling a rope was a private ritual, a reminder of the lives they had claimed. Each nick in the metal or fray in the fiber carried silent testimony, recording a history of pain that could not be erased. In the end, the executioner's tools were not just objects of wood, steel, or rope. They were extensions of authority, carriers of justice, and symbols of mortality. Their presence alone shaped the atmosphere of fear that held medieval societies together. Whether revered, dreaded, or secretly coveted, these instruments endured as lasting emblems of the thin line between order and terror. In many towns, the role of executioner was not taken on alone, but passed down through training. Young apprentices, often the executioner's sons, were introduced early to the grim trade. They began by handling ropes, preparing scaffolds, or assisting with minor punishments before being trusted with larger tasks. This gradual exposure ensured continuity of skill in a profession shunned by outsiders. For many, it was not choice but inheritance. The apprenticeship demanded more than physical strength. Precision, composure, and an ability to endure public scorn were as essential as wielding a blade. Boys learned to manage crowds, understand anatomy, and follow legal protocols. A mistake during training could bring disaster, so the master executioner enforced discipline harshly. The knowledge transmitted was as much about survival as about the mechanics of death. Few outsiders ever entered the trade voluntarily. The stigma attached to executioners meant that apprentices usually came from the same family line, bound by necessity rather than ambition. Marriages were arranged within certain circles, keeping the profession contained. This isolation reinforced the idea of executioners as a caste apart, both feared and needed, existing on society's edges. Apprentices were raised knowing their future was already sealed. Practical tasks shaped their early years. Apprentices sharpened blades, cleaned blood-stained garments, and maintained ropes and scaffolds. They also carried out punishments like floggings or amputations, building skill before attempting an execution. Through repetition, they grew accustomed to blood, screams, and the weight of judgment. Each task was a step closer to the final responsibility of taking a life. The relationship between master and apprentice was complex. Fathers expected obedience, but apprentices also carried the pressure of upholding family honor. Any sign of weakness was suppressed, for hesitation in public could mean humiliation or mob violence. Over time, bonds of trust formed, with the apprentice learning not only the techniques, but also the bearing of authority that came with the role. Despite the stigma, some apprentices gained notoriety even before becoming masters. Tales spread of prodigies who delivered clean executions with uncanny precision. Others were feared for their cruelty, showing eagerness rather than restraint. Such reputations followed them into adulthood, shaping their careers and the reactions of townsfolk who knew their names. A young apprentice could become infamous long before he wielded the main axe. Yet the apprenticeship was not without danger. Failed tasks or botched punishments drew anger from both victims and spectators. Apprentices faced the same risk of retaliation as their masters, sometimes targeted outside of work. They lived under constant scrutiny, forced to grow thick skin early. Their training was as much about enduring shame and hatred as about mastering tools and techniques. Ultimately, apprenticeships preserved the continuity of an unwanted but essential profession. Through this system, executioners passed on more than practical knowledge. They transmitted the resilience required to bear isolation, fear, and the heavy burden of enforcing the law. Every apprentice who stepped into his father's shadow inherited not only skills, but also the lifelong weight of judgment. When the Middle Ages drew to a close, the image of the executioner remained etched in the collective memory of Europe. They were remembered not only for the death they dealt, but also for their strange dual role as both outcasts and officials. Their lives embodied contradictions, reviled yet needed, shunned yet feared, despised yet relied upon. Stories of their deeds, whispered across generations, shaped a legacy both dark and compelling. In chronicles and records, executioners often appeared as nameless figures. Their identities blurred into the anonymity of their hoods, creating an aura of mystery. Some became infamous, like France's Sanson dynasty, who carried the role for centuries, but most remained in obscurity. Their anonymity protected their families from shame, but also stripped them of individual dignity, leaving behind only the shadow of their profession. Legends and superstitions grew around them, casting executioners as figures cursed or marked by fate. Some townsfolk believed their touch carried bad luck, while others sought them secretly for charms and healing, trusting in their supposed knowledge of the body. This paradoxical blend of fear and reliance followed them even after death, with graves often unmarked or placed outside consecrated ground. The moral weight of their work left deep scars. Accounts tell of executioners who turned to drink, tormented by the memory of botched beheadings or cries of the condemned. Others hardened, finding grim pride in their skill, boasting of swift deaths delivered cleanly. Whatever their stance, few escaped the inner toll of a life spent in such proximity to death and human suffering. Over time, the role of executioner began to change as legal practices evolved. The rise of professional courts, the decline of public spectacles, and the eventual move toward more humane methods shifted their duties. In some regions, executioners became integrated into broader systems of justice, though their stigma endured. Even as the gallows faded, their legacy clung to the darker corners of history. The executioner's image also became symbolic in art and literature. Painters, playwrights, and poets used the figure as a representation of justice, cruelty, or the inevitability of fate. Hooded silhouettes appeared in woodcuts, sermons, and morality plays, embodying mankind's struggle with punishment and power. Their presence in cultural memory ensured they would never be forgotten, even as the practice diminished. For their descendants, the inheritance was heavy. Many carried the stain of association, excluded from guilds, markets, or respectable marriage alliances. Others tried to reinvent themselves, abandoning the identity and seeking new lives in distant towns. Yet wherever their names appeared in records, the shadow of the axe lingered, marking their bloodline as one set apart from the rest. The story of the executioner closes not with triumph, but with an enduring reminder of society's contradictions. They were instruments of order, yet symbols of cruelty, protectors of law, yet pariahs in daily life. Their existence forces us to reflect on the price of justice and the burdens carried by those chosen to enforce it. In their legacy, we see not just the end of condemned lives, but the haunting face of humanity's struggle with power, morality, and death.